So in this segment, I wanted to discuss kind of Angela Merkel trying to rewrite history a little bit with her answers regarding Germany's dependence on Russian oil, and kind of I think that kind of helps us to see why Germany have been so inept at dealing with kind of Russian aggression and also the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What I'll do is, because the BBC haven't dubbed the interview and the question is in English, but her answer's in German, what I'll do is I'll mute her audio and I'll just kind of narrate what she's saying, and then I'll try and give my thoughts about it. I can't figure out another way to make it make sense, and then we'll go over some bits in the article, and then go to a Times piece where someone discusses it. So let's have a listen to the interviewer Kathy Adler, and then I'll mute the response and just kind of talk you through it.
You say in your memoirs that it became very clear to you that the biggest priority for Vladimir Putin was power and reducing Western influence in Europe that it had gained after the Cold War. But despite that, you allowed Germany to become energy dependent on Russia. How do you respond to those who criticize you and say that you put German business interests before European security?
So I think that's a great answer, a great question, because we have seen that with Russia being paralyzed on this issue. So I'll try and talk. I'll talk through the stuff that she says. Oh, it's really weird. She talks about German business interests. It's legitimate for politicians to take into business account to create favorable conditions for their national economy. And Russian oil and natural gas were very cheap, which we know that's one of the reasons why they were so dependent on it. Geography probably was another factor as well, considering there's a pipeline being built that was built between Russia and Germany. She says Germany has always had a very strong industrial base, and cheap energy was an advantage, which Germany has always been known historically for their manufacturing and efficiency. Makes sense. We can now see that we no longer source natural gas from Russia, for good reasons following its invasion of Ukraine. That our energy prices have risen, and I think I don't think that's a bit of a dishonest answer. I think the global price of energy has gone up partly because of the sanctions on Russia. So I don't think that's strictly true that just because they can't buy from Russia, the energy price has gone up. I think it's mostly down to just the global price going up, and a lot of price gouging going on, with a clear impact on our economic strength. Secondly, I believe that despite all difficulties, we should do everything possible to have a peaceful coexistence with Russia, because there is the idea that countries. Sorry, I'm kind of going over her answers with kind of my own analysis, which is not great for the listener. But I think you can differentiate what I'm saying versus what she's trying to say. Point being is that countries that trade together don't typically fight with each other, and that's the kind of philosophy that she was trying to go down, I believe. It turned out that some historians say Putin ultimately is a revisionist, which I think is true. He was unhappy with how the Cold War ended. He was a KGB agent at the time. For him, the breakup of the Soviet Union was the worst thing that could happen. And yet, while I was in office, I did my absolute best to find peaceful means to cooperate with one another. The problem is, though, with a guy like that who is a massive aggressor, you look at this, his actions. I think in Chechnya, his actions in Georgia, you can see he's always going to be the aggressor. You can't find peaceful solutions with people like that. I did try to curb the military attacks in Ukraine through the Minsk agreements. Though those agreements are not worth the paper they're written on. They worked to an extent for a few years, though rather poorly. They were there we go. I believe that the coronavirus pandemic accelerated certain developments. Okay, that's interesting. We can't say whether they would have happened in the way without the virus. I don't know about that. I don't think things would have played out that differently. Unless the Russian economy did take a hit. Unless your theory is that the Russian economy taking a hit accelerated Putin's plans because he needed something to try and boost the economy. We were unable to speak to Vladimir Putin. Okay. Or President Xi in person for a very long time. That's what independent. I don't know if I buy this one. I don't know if I buy the idea that because they couldn't communicate directly with Putin, that his views on things change, and President Xi's views on things change. I don't think that's true. I mean, it's very clear that China want to grab Taiwan. I don't think they could have done so or tried to do so in the last couple of years, if their military wasn't in complete shambles right now. But I don't think this argument from Merkel makes any sense. And Angela Merkel ironically accuses Vladimir Putin of being a revisionist. She is also being a revisionist in this situation. She is trying to defend her legacy, as Katya Adler put it earlier. The invasion of Ukraine, a new era has begun. We have to recognise that, unfortunately, I did everything I possibly could to stop it coming to this. I don't think that's true. I think if Germany was stronger in looking at energy alternatives post the invasion of Crimea, then you can make that argument. I don't believe I don't believe that this is the case at all. Oh, we got the question from Adler.
To energy dependency.
Oh, let me put it back to normal speed. Sorry, it's a bit of a mess.
Though, Dr. Merkel, because you have President Obama, who you were very close to at the time. He begged you not to build a second gas pipeline to Russia. It was built in 2014 after Vladimir Putin had already partially invaded Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky described that cheap gas that you talked about from Russia as a geopolitical weapon of the Kremlin. He said it was dangerous for all of Europe. But
she increased their dependency on Russian oil and gas. That's what Nord Stream 2 was going to do.
You didn't listen to Ukraine. You didn't listen to President Obama. Do you regret that now? What
she did was she favoured national interest, domestic interest, above Europe, above kind of the Western alliance, which you can blame her for to an extent, but you can also say that the job of politicians is to win. That's what we keep hearing from pro-Labour goons as well. You can say that it's not, politics isn't really about altruism, it's about getting your goals through, and when it's my team it's good, when it's your team it's not so good. But I think Germany's dependence on a state as aggressive as Russia was always going to be a mistake. It's easy to say in hindsight, I know, but after the invasion of Crimea, I think they should have known what's up. We've seen the same playbook before when a certain person from the 30s took the Sudetenland. I don't think we even meant to call it that, but it took parts of Czechoslovakia, and then he took all of Czechoslovakia, because you can't appease people like that. She says, "No, I don't regret that. We heard those warnings, of course, and I listened to them. At the time, no one was talking about cutting Russian gas exports altogether. It's a bit of a straw man. We reached an agreement with President Biden after Donald Trump left office that we could only start using Nord Stream 2 pipeline if energy was not being weaponized. I mean, it was always going to be weaponized, though. That's the problem. And I considered this agreement the right thing to do. As a result, gas never flowed through Nord Stream 2. The pipeline did not go into operation because of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, made it obsolete, of course. But I think they would have used it if they could have done. It was a major economic hit. The companies behind the pipeline weren't only... what did you say? Sorry. Missed that bit. Weren't only German companies. They were also European companies. And their economies took the hit, which, that makes sense. But in any case, gas never flowed through Nord Stream 2. Now, was Nord Stream 2 the one that was blown up? There's the key bit here. And she argues that we would have seen military conflict earlier. So she talks about the European companies bit. Their economies took the hit. In any case, gas has never flowed through Nord Stream 2. Here's Adler again asking a question.
Back further to 2008, then US President Bush wanted Ukraine to become a NATO member. You stopped Ukraine's progress towards membership at the time. You explain why in your memoirs. But if you had given the green light to Ukraine, would there be war there now?
So I think this answer from Merkel is the most egregious one. I think in this lineup of heavily revisionist, nonsensical arguments she makes during this interview. She says we would have seen a military conflict even earlier. It was completely clear to me that had we launched the membership action plan, the preliminary stage to NATO membership, President Putin would not have stood idly by and watched Ukraine join NATO. And that's why I wasn't the only one against it. Other European countries were also opposed. I worked closely with President Sarkozy, that would be of France. Ukraine itself was very divided back then, which is true. Many opposed NATO membership. But, fundamentally, the country did, I think, want to apply for NATO membership. So regardless of the country being divided or not, the politicians at the time wanted it. As first NATO members, we had to decide whether admitting Ukraine to NATO would also add to our security. It was clear to me the answer was no. I am convinced that it would have led to an earlier military conflict. But then, if Russia had made the move during the preliminary stage, I don't know if other members would have stood in. I don't know what protections would exist for a country applying to join NATO. But I think I imagine, I don't think Putin would have launched a full-scale invasion at that point, because I think he would have known it's too late, I think, to try and pull a stunt like that, because it'd be very obvious what he's trying to do. At least what he has done now, he's kind of couched his, quote, special military operation in the guise of dealing with the Azov battalion and that ilk of people, which, he's conned people into Russia into believing. How much they believe him or not, I don't know. But the idea that it would have launched a conflict earlier, I'm not sure about. Obviously, we're going into the multiverse here. Because Ukraine as a country would certainly have not been as prepared. I don't think Russia as a country would have been as prepared either. When you look at the state of the Russian military, it's really bad. It says Sweden and Finland disagree. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine... this is Adel asking the question here. They decided to join NATO to protect themselves. Which is true, that's what happened, yep. Yes, after President Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, this is Merkel speaking, an attack for which there is no justification, but until then, it's interesting to note that Finland never joined NATO. It's because they had a neutrality thing, and also they at the time saw it as a move that would have angered Putin. But like I said, you can't please someone who's authoritarian, who is an aggressor. It doesn't work. That's the problem. By kind of stopping Ukraine's NATO ascension, you're giving Putin what he wants. She talks about Finland's history with Russia, which is true. Finland and Sweden are an interesting example. They took part in many NATO exercises. They were, of course, integrated into European defence policy. They do hold geographical importance as well, she says, but they didn't join NATO. Because they also believed it would worsen relations with Russia, particularly Finland. I would have liked Ukraine to follow a similar path back in 2008. But then, if you wanted that, you should have called for it at the time then. No one can know what would have ever happened, which is true. That's true. It was only then that these two countries decided to join NATO, because they wanted to be part of the protectionist bloc. That's why. We'll leave it there for this interview. You can listen to the full thing. It's on iPlayer. There's some snippets here of the interview as well. Zelensky, he does disagree with some of the points Merkel makes regarding what happening earlier and things like that. He describes Merkel's NATO decision back then, and as well as Sarkozy's mistake, as a clear miscalculation that emboldened Russia. And I would agree. I would agree with that. I think it did embolden Russia. And we do have someone discussing the situation, Sir Arthur Michael, arguing this was the UK's ambassador from 2007 2010 to Germany, discussing the subject.
One of the mistakes she made was, apart from the migration one, which we can debate, was turning her back on nuclear power after Fukushima, And she did that partly for domestic political reasons. But the consequence of that was
There's also, I think, a fear around nuclear power in certain countries as well.
making Germany ever more dependent, or even more dependent, on Russian oil and gas. And I think history will judge that to have been a mistake.
What do you think were her qualities? I mean, for anybody to stay in office for 16 years.
We can skip the rest of this as fluff, but in my opinion, I agree with what Sir Michael Arthur is saying here, that she made Germany more and more dependent on Russian gas, and the fact that it's taken such a big economic hit. Germany's economy is in a mess right now. It's arguably doing worse than the UK's, which is crazy given all the turmoil the UK has gone through. We're talking just purely on GDP here, without factoring in things like living standards, which I think living standards are better than Germany. Depending on what kind of economic factors you look at, I think Germany would probably beat the UK pretty handily, probably have us wiped down. But if you look at GDP, which is the figure that most goons look at, German GDP is not doing great. Really since the pandemic, they recovered quicker than us, but they've kind of faltered really heavily. So I think that dependence on Russian gas, oil, and trade generally has been a massive problem. And this is what I mean. You can't do deals with authoritarians like that, because the whole idea of, well, if we do a lot of trade with this country, they're less likely to fight us. That is true. But then what happens when a third country gets attacked? What do you do in that situation? Because if you cut off trade, you've hurt yourself, especially when it's so obvious you needed that oil and gas to funnel your manufacturing sector, because German manufacturing is still pretty great. And if you look at the optics, Germany does have this kind of coveted status as being one of the best manufacturing countries in the world, arguably the best. German engineering is arguably the best engineering in the world, along with you got people like De Bauer in there and other people, probably up there with Japan in terms of some of the best engineering around, or at least historically it has been. But I think this has been a fundamental misstep with Angela Merkel, and she's very protective of her legacy, as you can imagine. But ultimately, I don't think it's great. I don't think her legacy will be looked at as fondly as she wants it to be, purely because she misplayed on this issue so much so that she emboldened an authoritarian to start slicing up parts land from their neighbour effectively, and she did very little to kind of deter it. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.